Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Gaming in the Wild, a video games podcast about games from the artistic and creative side of the tracks, from indie to AAA. My name's John, I'm your host. I'm a journalist based out here in Reykjavik, Iceland, where, much like last week, and much like for all of the weeks coming up for the winter season, it's dark, it's cold, days are getting short, so it's the perfect time for video games, more than ever. Although, I guess this year being kind of cancelled as it was, we've all had a lot more time to play games and do household things. I've been spending a lot of this year actually with houseplants. I mean, I've read some articles about how people generally have started paying more attention to that kind of thing, with being stuck in the house because of quarantine and COVID and that changing situation. Video games and houseplants have been trending, and without wishing to sound like too much of a hipster zeitgeist barometer or anything, welcome to my life usually, where I spend a lot of time with houseplants and video games. So this was a year that anyone with an uncool life suddenly became cool. This year I actually tried to grow some tomatoes and chilies and things like that in the house with some success. It's not like I had some vast bounty or anything, but I'm still getting cherry tomatoes from my windowsill cherry tomato plants that have grown to fill the entire window now, so I guess they're like 1.5 or 2 meters tall. Still getting tomatoes, very pleased about it. Got a few chilies as well, just 3 or 4, which, considering the amount of time that is spent studying these plants and trying to figure out how much water and sunlight they wanted and all that kind of thing, it's not a lot, but it's kept me busy. And I don't know, actually some of the chilies came out really well. The cherry tomatoes, there were so few that it's just like you pick one, you eat it, and then that's the kind of extent of what you can do with them. There's not really enough to make a recipe with them. But with chilies it's different. I got 4 or 5 giant, really spicy chilies and put them into curries. So I've been feeling pretty good about my my farmer's bounty this year. I also tried to grow some broccoli in the garden as an experiment, and some mint. Mint turned into a giant bush, which I took all the leaves from, dried them, and I've turned them into tea, like crushed them up and turned them into tea. Haven't tried much of it yet. I'm still waiting for the right time to try the mint tea. But the chilies are going strong. I don't know. Houseplants, video games, domestic life. It's pretty much everyone's 2020, I guess, to some degree. But video games were a big part of it, and this week I played a game that I wasn't expecting to be playing. It's not my genre. As you may know if you've listened to other episodes of the podcast, they usually start with this kind of dreamy, calm music, because they're kind of dreamy, calm games a lot of the time. And they have this kind of ambient moods to them and things like that. But Hades is a roguelike game, action game, dungeon crawler game, a loop-based game, fast and furious. And I'm not usually a big fan of roguelikes. I've not played them. I've felt that the things that I really like about video games are narrative and progression, moving through big worlds and exploration, and having a kind of a constantly evolving experience. Open world games are a big favourite of mine. Walking simulator games are a big favourite of mine. And so the Fast and Furious kind of arcadey, loop-based, adrenalized roguelike genre is new to me. But I think that Hades has actually turned a lot of people's heads who wouldn't traditionally go for this kind of game because of the hype of it. I mean, I first became aware of this game. I'm a fan of Supergiant. I've played Transistor and loved it. I played Bastion and liked it. I've tried to play Pyre. It was in the itch bundle for racial justice, so I have it on my Mac. I tried to play it there, but it wasn't working out, so I think I'm going to get that one on PlayStation 4. I've been a fan of Supergiant. I like their art style and the vision that they bring to their games. Transistor I thought was very successful and intriguing. And Hades is perhaps their biggest, most ambitious game to date. It draws on some things from their previous games. It's isometric with this kind of hand-drawn quality to the artwork, and really fitting kind of well-developed music by Darren Korb, who makes music for all their games. And it's an interesting one. It's been a really interesting journey for me. When I first started playing it, it took me a while to get my head around it because it was my first real journey into the roguelike genre. And so I've gone from not getting it, not liking it, through to kind of loving it now. So I've taken the journey that a lot of people who play Hades are probably going to be taking. And especially seeing as it was so present in the nominations for the 2020 Game Awards, it seemed like a good time to talk about it. It's kind of swept the board with nominations alongside The Last of Us Part 2. So it's going to be very interesting to see where the judges come down between those two games, one of which is a hand-drawn indie game, and The Last of Us Part 2 is like a huge blockbuster production. But the game was brought to my attention properly by LeBruce, and at Switch Indie Fix. They're two people that I follow on Twitter and talk to about games from time to time. They both absolutely adore Hades to a degree that made me just very curious about it. When someone flags up a game as their game of the year, even if it's not in a genre that I like, I'm instantly curious, and there was enough people that were into Hades that made me want to give it a shot, so I took the plunge, and I'm excited to talk about it this episode. But before we get into Hades, I will just mention briefly that I have a Patreon for this podcast, where regular listeners, supporters of the show, people that want to interact with me more, or the community of listeners around the show, can join in, support the podcast. It's at patreon.com/gaminginthewild, and for $1, $3, or $5 a month, you can get weekly sale recommendations, short exclusive episodes that touch on things that I maybe don't talk about in the main podcast, and you'll get an invite to the Discord community where you can hang out with the show's other patrons, talk about what games you're playing, meet some cool people. So patreon.com/gaminginthewild, if that's of interest to you. I really appreciate everyone who chooses to do so and support the show. Very helpful to me to have a little trickle of income to put into upgrading my equipment and getting more games to talk about. I'll also put a link in the show notes so you can find it easily there if you want to. And with that housekeeping out of the way, let's dive right in and talk about Hades. So Hades is a Supergiant game directed by Greg Kasavin, with an art director called Gen Z, and music by Darren Korb. And Darren Korb has a really fun way of describing the music that he makes for games. I went and looked at his Wikipedia page as I was researching this episode, and found that for Bastion his key phrase was acoustic frontier trip hop. For Transistor he called it old world electronic post-rock. And for Hades, his self-made-up genre was Mediterranean prog rock Halloween, which is why I chose the track we're listening to now. It has this kind of court music, kind of harpsichord chiming sound with plucked strings, but then he dropped a theremin on top of it to make it really kind of spooky and creepy. And his music, he clearly had a lot of fun with the music for this game. As Transistor was very simmering, and Bastion was quite kind of propulsive acoustic music, Hades goes for rock, and it crosses it with this kind of archaic sounding court music. So what you end up with is a really cool progressive soundtrack where, much like Hollow Knight, the music has phases, like a quiet phase when you enter the room, drums kick in when you find your first enemy, and then if you come to a big enemy, then suddenly there's these huge riffs that arrive. And he had a lot of fun making it. There are a couple of good documentaries that you can watch about the process of making this game. I also found it really fun listening to Gen Z talk about her decisions as the art director. She researched a lot of mythology and ancient Greek aesthetics when she was coming to the visual style of the game, and she kind of used as hinge points the kind of perfect Athenian physique and beauty amongst the gods, as most of the characters in this game are gods. And so there's a lot of very kind of hot cartoon gods rendered in a really cool way throughout the game. And I guess roguelike dungeon crawler just sounds like a bit of a word soup of commonly used genre terms, but it's worth talking about what that means. Hades is a run-based game, so you take a run, you see how far you can get. If you die, you start again at the beginning. Each run is through a kind of a semi-randomized layout. There are several room layouts, but they all come in a random order and a little bit different each time. And you get different enemies, different rewards in a different order. So you get familiar with the kind of the flavour of each area, and you know what enemies you're roughly going to come up against. But it's always a little bit different to give it a bit of a twist. At the end of each area, there's a boss that you'll always face, although even the bosses evolve later in the game. But on each run, you earn several different currencies, which you can then trade in before your next run to improve your character. However, some things that you'll get as rewards during each run, such as boons from the gods, they upgrade your weapons and give you magical effects, and they lend you their power. You lose these at the end of each run, so you start again each time a little bit stronger, a little bit wiser, and with a little bit more of an idea of good combinations of boons from the gods, good combinations of weapons and power-ups that you can get. So you can take deeper runs each time you go until you are beating the game with some regularity. And I don't usually use the word beating a game, I use the word finishing a game because it just feels better to me. But in the case of Hades, you are beating it in a way. It feels like beating is more accurate because it throws a lot at you. And that, I guess, is the part of the roguelike experience that I really needed to experience myself to understand the appeal of the genre. It's the idea that power-ups that you get on your way through each run, especially in Hades, combine in the most brilliant, wild, unexpected ways. And I will talk about like what kind of builds I ended up doing, and they really change the way you play the game entirely, whether you're using an attack or whether you're dashing or whether you're avoiding or whether you're trying to get as many hits in as possible so you can call up a god. All of these kind of things, they change your playstyle entirely, and they always are a little bit randomized, so you're getting like a real mixed bag, and you're learning to work with what you've got and to use your built-up knowledge of what the different boons from the gods do to arrive at a build that you feel like will take you all the way to the end. And there is a huge amount of depth to the gameplay, so that's just my little brief outline, but I will dip into it again later. But let's talk about the story. You play Zagreus. He is the son of Hades, the king of the underworld. And Zagreus is a rebellious son who has decided to escape from the underworld to the world's surface with the help of the Olympian gods, his distant relatives, who have just kind of discovered of his existence, and they've decided to help him on his journey. That's why they lend the power to him. And the way that the story is woven into the gameplay is really cool, because Zagreus is an immortal. He's the son of Hades, the king of the underworld, this powerful god, this bulky figure with red glowing eyes. And Hades is the brother of Zeus and Poseidon, so he's part of that pantheon of really powerful gods. And Zagreus is his son. And so if you get beaten in a run, Zagreus will emerge back in the house of Hades at the base of the underworld through a kind of a moon pool made out of blood, and he just kind of walks out and he gives some comment like, "Ow, that hurt," which is really fun because like dying in these games is kind of frustrating and off-putting. To die so much and fail so much, you have to get really comfortable with failing. And I've seen that that's something that the developers were sympathetic to, and so the way that they handle it here, by weaving it into the story, so every death is one attempt of many from Zagreus to escape the underworld, and because he's an immortal, he just arrives back at the House of Hades every time. So the roguelike mechanic is actually woven gracefully into the story here in a really cool way. It makes it a lot of fun. So the House of Hades kind of acts as a hub world for the game. So after every run you arrive back, and Hypnos is there, acting as a kind of a concierge, the god of sleep, the god of eternal sleep. I'm sorry, by the way, if there's anyone listening to this who is a Greek mythology nerd, I might massacre things somewhat. I'm not exactly sure how true to life the roles of some of these gods are in the game. They are characters based on, the mythology. It's maybe not like a history study here. But Hypnos is the concierge. Achilles is there as a god, a human hero who has been given a place in the court of Hades. Nyx also has a place in the court, the Queen of the Night. She's this really cool, dark, gothic figure with a kind of void voice who gives you some advice and helps you out on your journey. There is also like a few other characters. Cerberus is there, the three-headed hound of hell, the guard of the underworld, who is treated like the house pet. It's really fun. He's a giant red dog. And also there are other characters. There is Megaira the Fury, one of the three Fury sisters, who's kind of an enforcer for Hades. And these characters reside in the House of Hades, where you also have a bed chamber, where you can exchange darkness, which is one of the game's currencies, to upgrade Zagreus for the next run, and to do other things like to chart your progress through a book of challenges that, like clearing 10 chambers with one weapon or getting every boon from one god, things like this. And then you'll step through into an armory, and your base weapon is a sword. But as you progress, you'll get the ability to unlock 6 different weapons, all very different, all encourage very different play styles. And that's like a big part of the game too. All of the weapons have names and stories, and as you progress, Achilles will give you his codex. So every time that you use a weapon, or you meet a god, or you meet a character, you can look at this book, and you can see that you've also unlocked a little bit more context, a little bit more story and history. So as you're going, you're also unlocking all of this different stuff that makes it feel like progression. For a game that is based on loop and repetition, this game does an incredibly good job of making you feel like you're progressing. And part of that is that just the pure ingenuity of making the immortal rebirth the fail state. So you come out of the pool ready to go again. And after you've kind of selected your weapon and your charms, and you've powered yourself up, and you've talked to everyone, then it's time to step out again. So you step out for an escape attempt. And I'm no expert on the Greek underworld of mythology, but in this game at least, you begin at Tartarus, which is the lowest level of hell, kind of. It's like a sort of a ghastly void in a prison with guards and these hands that grab you as the enemies and stuff. I looked up what Tartarus is known as, and it's described as, quote, beneath the underworld, as the earth is beneath the sky. So it's the very deepest pit where souls are put away for eternity. You'll then graduate to the Asphodel Meadows, which is like, supposedly in mythology, it's like the medium kind of basic spot for the afterlife, but it's portrayed here as like a little bit like the Christian hell. Lots of fire, lots of hellish creatures. After that, you come to Elysium, where great heroes and noteworthy people get to live their afterlife. But it's still pretty locked down. There's lots of different soldiers there. There's an arena there, so there's lots of chariots to fight and all that kind of thing. And at the end of each area, you'll get like a boss. Escaping from the underworld is supposed to be impossible. So Hades, part of his job is to kind of have this militarized army of just traps and monsters and guards that stop any shade that would dare to try and escape from the underworld. So what Zagreus is doing is kind of trying to get through this impossible maze of difficulty and destruction to get out onto the surface. And once you know what you're doing, it is really, really fun. And I said just now that once you know what you're doing, it's really fun. And that is a factor that's worth bearing in mind. I think the only issue that I've really had with Hades was the entry barrier to enjoying it properly. And what I mean by that is there is a lot of systems at play in this game. For example, there are several different currencies. There is mead, coins, keys, diamonds, darkness, pomegranates, aka poms of power, jewels, and as you move through the dungeon, you'll usually have 2 exits. So you clear a room, and then you choose which room you want to go to next. And each door has an icon on it for one of these currencies, so you can kind of choose what you're going to earn. And it takes a long time to really get your head around what they all are. It's very disorientating at first. You're like, I don't know what's going to help me. I don't know what these jewels are for. Coins and mead bottles, you're like, I'm not sure what I should be getting here. Like, what is the most powerful thing, or what is the most helpful thing? And there are so many systems that it's just dizzying at first. But I will say that once you've got your head around it, for example, I have in my mind now, like, the hammer is the door you should choose first because those weapon upgrades are so powerful. And then the boons from the gods are the second door that I would choose. Darkness you take back with you, and jewels you take back with you, and mead bottles you can gift to characters and gods, so they're handy to have. Whereas palms of power are very, very temporary. They just buff the level of an existing power-up. And then coins you can only use in the run, and they vanish at the end of the run. So you have to get your head around all of that to really enjoy it. But once you have, the amount of depth that complexity gives you is really something. And that is most noticeable when it comes to the boons from the gods. So let's say you finish a room, and at the end of the door, one door has a coin logo, one door has a trident logo. You will know that that trident means you're going to encounter Poseidon. So you choose the Poseidon door, you go into the next room, you beat that room, and then you have an encounter with Poseidon, who says, like, hey, nephew, I see you're trying to get out of the underworld. Let me lend you this power. And he'll give you one of his powers. Poseidon is the god of the ocean, and so they're all kind of themed on waves, and they're themed on repelling enemies and smashing enemies into the walls like the tide. So you can repel enemies with your Poseidon power. You'll get to choose from 3. And they are all stackable, and the many boons that you will get all combine in unexpected ways, and this is the coolest part of the game. So I'm going to take you through like what I considered to be my best build, and that was to always get the Daedalus hammer first, to upgrade my spear. And the hammer can upgrade your spear so that when you stab, it actually stabs 3 times in a fanning shape. It enlarges the range of the spear. So if you have a triple stabbing, far stabbing spear, you're covering a huge amount of the screen with your attack, and you can really keep enemies at arm's length. If you combine that with something from Poseidon, it will also push enemies away. If you combine that with something from Zeus and stack it, then you'll get a lightning attack that zips between all of the enemies on the screen after you've hit them. And so you're pushing enemies away with a very wide, powerful attack and striking everything on screen with lightning. And at that point, you start getting palms of power, which level up the hit points of your Poseidon and Zeus attacks. And you end up feeling really, really powerful and like you can handle anything. But then a different build might be, let's say you don't get Poseidon or Zeus, you get Dionysus and Artemis. And Dionysian effects are to give hangovers. He's a really funny character. He just appears with a glass of wine and he's like, hey, Zags, coming up here to party, are you? Here's something to help you on your way. And so every time you're hit with a Dionysian effect, your enemies will become hungover, which is like being poisoned, and their hit points will tick down. And then if you have an Artemis the Huntress attack, then suddenly you'll be producing arrows that with every attack that home in on people, things like this. And then also there is the call function. So that's the most powerful appearance that a god will make. It's like you have a meter at the bottom of your screen, and when you've hit enough enemies, it's at full, and you can call a god who will just like deliver an OP overpowered attack that will just wipe out whatever you're facing. So there are all these different ways that you can do things. And I mean, I've found some really surprising effects. Like on one run, I used these boxing gloves, these big kind of melee gloves instead of the spear. So you have to have enemies close to you to hit them. And so you can't use a Poseidon effect with that because it will push them away out of your range and you can't hit them anymore. So instead I was going in for Dionysus and Zeus with a shielding effect from Athena. So I could dash into combat shielded by the power of Athena and then deliver these poisonous lightning punches and take people out that way. But the shielding was really essential for that because you're going to take damage if you're getting in close. I think maybe the most interesting and unusual build that I got was just a massively overpowered Poseidon dash. So my dash was my main weapon. So moving across the screen past enemies was just wiping them out. And then I also had this effect from Demeter, the goddess of bounty and farming and nature, but in this instance she's portrayed as a god of winter, the winter season. and I was able to drop these sentry laser crystals that would just blast out rays. So I was sort of standing in the middle of this kind of phalanx of sentry crystals with my gloves, just daring the enemies to come at me. Most of them were dying before they were getting to me, and I was finishing them off with the gloves, and it was just a completely different way of playing. Really exciting and different every time. So I've been through the whole journey with this game, I would say. I've gone from being frustrated and not really getting the roguelike repetition through to really appreciating the depth and complexity of all of the mechanics that the game has to offer. And it's become like a really compulsive, addictive experience. I have been through the game, I think about 30 times, 30 escape attempts now, varying between, let's say, 15 minutes if you die early through to 25 if you get to the end really quickly, or half an hour or even 40 minutes if you take a really slow route or you have a build where you can't clear rooms quickly. So I think that adds up to a good 15 or 16 hours of play. And after the first 2 or 3 hours, once I had learned the ropes, it was great. Really enjoyed it. The way that every god encounter gives you a little more chat from the gods. The story is told in this very fragmented way, where every time you bump into a character during an escape attempt, such as Sisyphus or Minotaur or these different characters that you'll encounter, they'll talk to you a little bit. Every time you talk to a god to collect a boon, they'll talk to you a little bit and fill you in a little bit about family relations amongst the Olympian gods and about their relationship with Hades, your father. And then every time you come back to the house of Hades, you've learned more about your situation. And there's like a really cool story here that is slowly uncovered by going through this escape attempts setup. It's just a really cool way of delivering a story. And I think what Supergiant has done here is really noteworthy and admirable, in that they've taken the perceived weaknesses of the roguelike genre and turned them into a strength through this very thoughtful and well-developed, well-conceived way to deliver both a kind of addictive, adrenalizing game experience with a slowly unfolding narrative. So that's Hades. I had a really good time with it, very surprised to have enjoyed it as much as I did. I'm not quite at the kind of want to like put a ring on it and call it my game of the year level that a lot of people are, but I can imagine if you were an existing fan of this genre, then Hades would be like your dream game in a lot of ways. But it definitely would make my kind of extended mentions for game of the year, just because of the sheer craft, the amazing craft and attention to detail, the visuals, the music, the storytelling, the kind of the cartoon extensions and the good writing to turn the Greek pantheon into this really entertaining kind of soap opera-like family drama, which those old stories are, you know. And there are so many like sub-stories in there, like Orpheus is in there, Orpheus and Eurydice, Theseus and the Minotaur, Sisyphus. All of these characters are in the story, and you can interact with them in this really fun way and give them mead to get more of their story and try and help out and just kind of see Zagreus's relationships with his contemporaries in the underworld develop. Really, really fun. So much to like about it. I could talk forever about all of these detailed systems, but I don't really think it makes for good podcast listening. I will say that if you do decide to get into Hades and if you're stuck on anything, then just tweet at me. I'm at Gaming in the Wild on Twitter. I might also try and stream some of this game on Twitch at Gaming in the Wild. You can also follow me on Instagram, on YouTube, where I post visual versions of these podcasts, and of course on Patreon if you're wanting to get into supporting the show, patreon.com/gaminginthewild. If you're listening on an iPhone or using an Apple product, also dropping a star review or even writing a couple of words on the Apple Podcast app. That's really helpful too. If you drop star ratings on the podcast, then it helps other people to find it amongst all of the search results. So that's really helpful. Thanks for that. Thanks very much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed it. I'll be back next week with another episode. Take care of yourselves and each other, and bye-bye.